All right. So good evening, everyone. Welcome. I think you will probably know me. I'm Rabbi, one of the co-founders of the Chabura. I'd like to begin by actually thanking the ASF. I don't know if anyone's here, but if they listen to the recording, we're very grateful to Jason and Anna for helping us set up and for giving us this beautiful space. And just a couple of words before we introduce tonight's speakers about the Chabura. There's a few new faces. Just for those unfamiliar, we're an international Bet Midrash with a global online learning platform. We do events in person. We also do events online, regular classes. We do podcasts. Please do check out our website. And Chabura has become like a network of great teachers, educators, rabbis, students. And I think tonight's event is really testament of that. Rabbi Zarnighian lives in Philadelphia. I'll introduce him in a moment, but he's someone who's been really involved in the Chabura in many ways. And thankfully, because of the internet and Chabura capitalizing on that, we've been able to make the most, even though he doesn't necessarily live in the same places where all these students of his now are. As well, Jackson as well. Really, I don't know how he originally got involved, but through the Chabura, it's become a network of great students and scholars, and please God, become a rabbi, doctor. Those are the two paths he's on now. So I think do get involved and find out about the different events we're doing. What brings us tonight here is actually the Dart Press. Dart Press is led by Sina Kahen. It's really a powerhouse, and it's an amazing project of publishing books and works, making it accessible to a wider audience, translating it into English. And tonight we're going to be focusing on two books that have been published very recently. The introduction to Meiri's to the Pirkei Avot commentary that he has, his introduction, his Hakdama, and the Ibn Ezra's introduction to his Pirush on the Torah. Our speakers will elaborate and go into some details and examples and why these texts are worth translating, important, and a valuable addition to the Jewish library. So we're very grateful to Rabbi Zarnighian, who is the rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Kahal Kadosh, Mikveh Israel, in Philadelphia. He was born and raised in Great Neck, and his great-grandfather was the great rabbi Mullah Yosef Dilmani from Iran, and is very much in his footsteps. Rabbi Zarnighian has received semicha from Rabbi Sami Kassin and Rabbi Yaakov Peretz of Shehevar Sephardic Center in Jerusalem, and he serves his country as a chaplain in the U.S. Air Force Reserves. We're also very grateful to Jackson Gardner, who earned his bachelor's in neuroscience with a minor in Jewish studies from Emory. After college, he studied at Yeshivat Darchei Noam in Yerushalayim before settling in the Bronx, which is what you're doing now. You're pursuing your medical degree there, Einstein Medical College. And as we said, your long-term goal is to integrate both the science, medical knowledge that you have with the Torah and the Judaic studies. And we're very grateful to both of you for being involved in the Chabura, and also in particular, actually not just coming and speaking, but actually writing and working through things and helping the Dart Press really grow. So these two works are not only foundational instructions and introductions to Torah study, but they also represent two important aspects or approaches that the Chabura we seek to promote. Through understanding Peshat, we focus on the precision of learning and the different layers, and the chain of tradition is obviously a fundamental part of halakha, of the way that we approach Torah study, through appreciating tradition, the oral law. So let's start by maybe setting the stage, Jackson. If you can give us a brief overview of who the Ibn Ezra and the Meiri were. Let's start maybe with Ibn Ezra, his life, his travels, and give us some color of who this fascinating figure is. And then, if you can, also the Meiri, tell us a little bit about his worldview that he was from and the play Provence.
Sure. Okay. First of all, very grateful to you and everyone else involved for helping set this amazing event up. I'm very excited to talk about these things. I think they're super interesting, and I'm very happy for more people to share in it and discuss it. So Ibn Ezra was born around like 1089 CE. So just to kind of like set the generational block. So Harambam is born about a generation afterwards, and Ibn Ezra is born around when Yitzhak al-Fasi, the Rif, ends up passing away. So he was really that sort of like middle generation, and he was born initially in a place called Tudela, Spain, which is more in the north of Spain, but at the time it was under the Almoravid control. So the Muslims at that time had control of most of Spain. The northern Christian kingdoms were just starting to kind of reconquer a lot of those places, which eventually was ultimately successful for the whole place. They conquered everything. But at the time where he was born, and especially southern Spain, was known sort of colloquially as Al-Andalus. So that was where Harif was born and raised. That's where Harambam was initially raised. That's also where others like Yehuda Levi was born, Shlomo Ibn Gabiro, like all of these figures were born there. So Ibn Ezra, just like all of them, after he was born and grew up initially as a child, we know that he traveled down to places such as Cordova and Lucena, which were sort of like the main yeshivot systems at the time. So Lucena was run by likely the Migash, who was the successor of the Rif at that yeshiva and the teacher of Harambam's father. And then Cordova was sort of another major center where we had prior figures like Shemuel Hanagid and other important Hachamim. So he went and he studied in those places. At the same time, just like most of the Jews of Al-Andalus educationally, he was tutored in math and science and philosophy, music, poetry. It's sort of known, obviously, as like the golden age of Spain because of just how much kind of broad education was pushed in the area. But unfortunately, Muslim persecution began as a new faction called the Almohads take over. And they begin to essentially push for a forced conversion to Islam, and if not, you have to leave, which wasn't the policy before. So as a result of that and other various personal struggles, we know Ibn Ezra generally struggled with poverty at the time. He wasn't very successful in his business ventures. He couldn't always support himself, so he was forced to ultimately travel north into Greater Europe, where he ended up going to initially, I believe, Rome and different parts of Italy. And when he ended up going sort of to northern Italy in Lucca is where he decided to start writing most of his main Torah works, because he noticed that in Greater Europe, the Jews there had not been exposed to most of what was the norm in Al-Andalus. They didn't have the great Arabic treatises on grammar because they couldn't speak Arabic. So he wrote Sefer Moznaim, which tries to kind of translate figures like Ibn Hayyuj and Yonah ibn Janah and others from Arabic into Hebrew. He wrote his first Torah commentary, which is, I think, what most who've studied Ibn Ezra are familiar with. So it's a very short commentary that's printed now in Mikra Gedolot. After being in Italy for a while, he ends up going to Provence, which is in what we today call southern France. And from there he went into northern France. We know he corresponded with Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam and other grandsons of Rashi. And eventually he ended up in northern France writing a new sort of longer commentary on Torah. Unfortunately, we only have Shemot today and certain parts of Bereshit. We don't have the rest of it. But that was sort of a new version where he expands a lot more on what he wants to talk about. And then in his final years, he ends up moving actually to London, where he wrote a work called Yesod Morah V'Sod HaTorah, which he wrote for a close student of his, sort of a philosophical treatise explaining the 613 commandments and other such related topics. And then we don't know how he passed away, but that's how the story ends for him. Just another interesting tidbit is Yehuda Levi and him actually were born in the same place. They were very close friends. They cite each other quite a bit, wrote poetry for each other. They seem to have had a very special friendship throughout their years. And then just switching to Menachem HaMeiri, so he was born in the generation around right after Harambam, so about the mid-1200s. And he was born in Provence, specifically in Perpignan, which is sort of in the broader region of Languedoc. Sort of a misnomer is that at this time it was not really southern France. Languedoc was its own kingdom, separate from France, so they referred to the northern French as just French, and they were their own kingdom. So Meiri really was raised in this completely different sort of area, and at the time of Meiri's sort of upbringing, it was a sort of hotbed of a lot of battles between different major centers. A lot of the Andalusian Hachamim, like Ibn Ezra and others, had fled up to the southern French region, and they brought all of their stuff, and they were translating from Arabic, and they were bringing the culture, and for the most part, Provence embraced it. At the same time, you had the study methods of the northern French, so the Tosafot and Lachi, who I'm sure many of us are familiar with, they were starting to kind of come down and try and influence. And then you had a region called Catalonia, which was sort of in northern Spain. That's where Ramban and Rashba and those figures come from. And that kingdom at the time had actually conquered Languedoc, and their stuff was now starting to come in. So Meiri was really born and raised in a very tumultuous sort of milieu. And his major works, like Bet Midrash, try to systematize a lot of these different things and a lot of these different people. He cites Harambam, he cites the southern French figure La'avad, he talks about the Tosafot at times. He tries to kind of synthesize everything and balance everything and embrace kind of all the different cultures, which led him to write his Hakdama and general commentary to Pirkei Avot. He also had, unfortunately, a hard life. I believe he was orphaned as a child. His children were taken captive at a certain point in his younger years. We don't really know anything else. And he seems to have been well off otherwise in terms of his finances, unlike Ibn Ezra, but he never held seemingly a major position. And at least in the Ashkenazi world for a long time, Menachem Meiri's works were not known to us. They were cited by Sephardim, but not necessarily Ashkenazim until, I would say, maybe, you can correct me, Rabbi, if you remember, I think 150 years ago, sometime in the 1800s.
Late 1800s.
Right, so that was really when Beta Behira and these works became very known again, and a lot of scholarship flourished because of it.
Right, is there anything you want to add on about their lives before we get into the books itself?
It was the tiny little tidbit that I'll add to what Jackson shared with us, is that you'll notice that there's a common trend among Torah scholars of the Middle Ages, and really to a large extent in all subsequent generations, of tremendous suffering and tremendous hardship. And you kind of ask yourself, like, well, that doesn't seem very fair, it doesn't seem very just, it doesn't seem that those who devote themselves to the Torah have to go through all this difficulty just to maintain what they do. And yet our Chachamim say, that the words of the Torah only are sustained and are retained and transmitted to the next generation by those who kill themselves to keep it alive. So in a certain sense, it's also good, it's good chizuk when you study their lives and you study their history and the difficulties that they had to go through to leave us the legacy that they did, the legacies that they did. You gain a certain sense of appreciation that they really bled and teared and shed copious amounts of sweat, I'm sure, just to make sure that the Torah was transmitted from one generation to the next. Even Ezra also very often will do this in his in passing, just very casually he'll say, and by the way, I'm in such and such city when writing this, and it was very difficult, and yet I composed this portion of my commentary when I was here, and so on and so forth. So sometimes even on ships during voyages he would write. So never let a moment go to waste. Yeah.
So let's focus on the book Understanding Peshat, the Ibn Ezra's one. Maybe you can start. Why are these introductions, Hakdamot in particular, so important? Why do you think it's worthwhile? I know you wrote for the other one, but you were involved in this one a little bit, or you're familiar with it.
Yes, I wrote an article.
Speak in general as well. Why introductions?
I wrote an article for Chabura on the significance of Peshat in the Sephardic tradition, and it's something that is, I think, as Jews and as Americans both, we really, really should appreciate. In the American world, there's a lot of focus on what is popular in political circles and legal circles. The whole textualist versus living constitutional way of interpreting statutes in the Constitution. And then among Jews, you have the way that's often taught in Jewish day schools, and then later on in yeshivot as well, in higher education. You have a very, very strong emphasis and focus in studying the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, through a particular lens, through a particular tradition, which is very much focused on the allegory, on the Midrash, with very little emphasis on the grammar, the structure, and to a large extent the history behind the text. I'll give you an example just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. This week's parasha is what? Lech Lecha, yes? Okay. Everybody know the famous story of Abraham going out to save his poor nephew who got captured, and unfortunately, Lot sought out literally and metaphorically greener pastures. There's a battle that ensues, the 4 kings against the 5, he gets captured. Does anybody remember what happens next? What does Abraham go out with to save Lot?
It's Chanichav, no?
Okay. Well,
There's
you're quoting a pasuk. That's already a head start.
There's a certain number of Chanichim that he goes out with. And Rashi says they're all...
Yeah, and
Rashi says it's just...
Eliezer.
Eliezer.
Yeah, because it adds up according to the numerical value of Eliezer's name. Now...
One man.
But that it was one man. Namely that it was one man, not an entire platoon of troops that went out to wage war to save Lot. Okay, so that makes for a very good Hollywood film, by the way. I'm surprised that nobody has made a play or a movie depicting this. But it's against the Peshat, the simple, straightforward meaning of the text, and it's also ridiculous, right? It's also, if you were to ask Rabbeinu ibn Ezra or the Meiri, not what the text of the Midrash that is often cited, in this case by Rashi, not what it was meant to be in the first place. And so this takes us to one of the most significant milestones in bringing Ibn Ezra to an English-speaking audience, and that is Ibn Ezra's main focus, and maybe Jackson will elaborate on this. There are 4 different camps that he identifies of people who interpret the Torah a certain way. Some are very allegorical, like we just gave an example of that, right? Another very good example that you'll see, and there's a sort of a tendency towards this movement in some online groups. I don't know how popular it is in real life, but for people to be more literal about the text. The neo-Karaites, if you will, people who take the text of the Torah quite literally to the point where, they'll say, Shabbat is a lot easier than you think. It just means don't do any work. The holidays, they're really supposed to begin during the day, not at the evening of the Jewish calendar, like we as Jews traditionally observe, that the day begins with the night. And there are many other examples, right? Cooking a kid in its mother's milk really only just means cooking a kid in its mother's milk. It doesn't mean you can't have a cheeseburger. So there's and then there are other examples of different camps that Ibn Ezra identifies, and ultimately he settles for the one that is embraced by our ancestors, by our Chachamim, that of textualism, that of tradition, and that of loyalty to what he calls, he has different names for them. Sometimes he refers to them as Kadmonenu, our elders. Sometimes he refers to them as Hama'atikim, the transmitters or the minters, however you want to translate that word. There's a certain reverence to tradition that Ibn Ezra will focus on throughout his writings, at deference even to his own opinion. So very often, for example, just last week we read about a woman in the Torah, Yiska, otherwise known as Jessica in English, right? That's a biblical name. A lot of people don't know that. So there's a midrash that Rashi quotes, and he says, this is really Sarah, and this is whom Abraham married. Abraham married Yiska, and if you look in the Art Scroll family charts in your Art Scroll Humashim, you'll see it says Yiska/Sarah. So Ibn Ezra says that's not true. These were 2 different people. The text says so. It says very clearly that they were different people. But he says, Aval Kadmonenu Amru, our elders say that they were the same. V'im halacha nekabel. And if that's the tradition they had, we have to accept it. He doesn't say if it's a tradition you have to accept or not, though, but I'm not going to go down that road. So those are just a few examples of why, to get back to the point, why studying Ibn Ezra is so important and what his revolution in teaching Peshat did for us.
And just if I can push you one thing, so in terms of the way we learn Torah, let's say in terms of like a curriculum of a school, or just the approach one has to text for young children, but also for adults, I would say, right? Like, what would you say that, what can be changed? What should happen?
Well, what does Ibn Ezra say should be changed? He gives a very good reminder for all of us to place heavy emphasis on the Targum. The Targum is the Aramaic, some say translation, I like to say elucidation. It's the Aramaic commentary on the Torah that keeps cryptic terms that you cannot really clearly decipher just from knowing Hebrew in the most simple and straightforward way possible. It's such a minimal requirement to the point where the Gemara in Kiddushin, the Gemara says if a person wants to get married on the condition that he's a karyan, he is a reader, he knows how to read, then those of you who lane here, it's not enough that you can read the Torah. He says you have to also be able to learn Targum, because that's what the Talmud says. The Talmud says you have to be able to read Targum in order to be somebody who is well read, who's a reader, right? So Ibn Ezra says at a minimum that's our standard, even though he disagrees with Targum sometimes. Sometimes he takes issue, but that's the baseline. And then after that, if you can read letters, if you can read Hebrew, and you can understand the words that you are reading together with the Targum, then jump into further commentary. Jump into the commentaries that Ibn Ezra was going through from the French rabbis at the time, his own commentary, let's say. But I don't even think Ibn Ezra would tell you to study his commentary before you know the basics of Hebrew grammar, how to understand what you are reading, and to know the Targum. That's a very, very important skill. If you don't know Aramaic, by the way, don't worry. I didn't grow up speaking Aramaic either, and no one taught me how to understand.
So they speak in Iran?
In some parts actually, but the Kurds in Iran do. But if you know basic Hebrew and you read the Aramaic, you do Shinai Mikra, you read the Aramaic with your parasha reading every week, you pick it up like this. It's very easy to pick up.
Jackson, and if you want to speak a little bit more about defining Peshat, obviously we've touched about it, but maybe giving us maybe a sort of definition and also the often we have this approach of like the 5 layers, the Darash and the Remez and Sod. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and that framework. What do you think Ibn Ezra would have thought about that?
Sure. Right. So in terms of Peshat, so I think the common misconception perhaps that people will often have is that Peshat means the literal word, and I think the Rabbi alluded to this a little bit, that means that, I read, don't do melacha. And I say, okay, great. The literal meaning is don't do melacha, and that's all it says, right? There's no Torah sheba'al peh. There's no oral tradition behind anything. I'm taking the words very, very literally based on the grammar and the meaning and the context, and that's about it. But when you look at how Ibn Ezra comments on things, and also how Rambam talks about it in places, how Rav Saadia Gaon talks about it, really all the Andalusian Hachamim in their commentaries, the ones that we have, they seem to take the Torah Sheba'al Peh and they put it with the Peshat. Rabbeinu Saadia actually, as one of his requirements of understanding Peshat, says it cannot contradict the core oral tradition. So, for example, Ibn Ezra on the verses which talk about, the ot and the totafot and like what are these like random things like signs on your hands and between your eyes, all these things. And he says it could mean just it's a total metaphor. There's no tefillin, there's no requirement for anything. It's just God metaphorically telling people always think about these things, the covenant. But he says because in this case, our ancestors, the Atikim, those who transmitted the Torah Sheba'al Peh, because they told us that tefillin is a physical thing that I actually do have to put on my body. That is the Peshat meaning, and that is what God intended behind this. So, as a result of that, I think the best way to define Peshat, according to these figures, is what is technically called the sensus communis of a text. Sensus communis basically means what is the connotation of the words that I'm saying. So for example, like an idiom in English, if I say that, God forbid a person kicked the bucket, right? I don't mean that they literally kicked a bucket. I mean that unfortunately they passed away, right? We say I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. I'm not going to eat a horse, but I'm very, very hungry. And that is essentially the same thing here with Peshat. There are certain phrases and there are certain statements which don't mean the literal meaning. They mean a contextual sort of understood meaning by the audience. And so for Ibn Ezra and others, the idea behind Peshat is that there was, a group of ancient Israelites at Har Sinai. And at Har Sinai, Moshe Rabbeinu presents the terms of the covenant. Initially, Be'al Peh, he teaches them the various commandments from God via the revelation. He talks about all the different details. Harambam gets into this a lot more in some of his writings. But at a certain point, towards the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, he decides to finally write down the written Torah as we have it in the scrolls. But by that time, 40 years later, the ancient Israelites have already been learning all of these laws and these terms. And so when the ancient Israelites read Totafot, they're not going to think, oh, maybe it's a metaphor or whatever. They're going to think, well, the last 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu has been telling me that, we have this law from God that I need to put tefillin on. So that is now the contextual, communal meaning of the word when I read Totafot. So for Ibn Ezra and these figures, Peshat is really about trying to figure out the ancient Israelites' understanding of the text, which would have been contextual based on ancient Near East literature and language and poetry and symbolism. It would have been based on the core oral laws that they received at Sinai from Moshe, and it would be based, of course, on grammar and context and all of these factors. In terms of the other interpretive methods, I think today we often say you have Peshat, you have Midrash, you have Remez, and you have Sod. So that sort of distinction doesn't really start until much later in Jewish history. I know the Benu Behayeh is a very famous proponent in his commentary where he really breaks down all of these categories. But it seems generally, in my view personally, to be more so based on not necessarily Christian, but perhaps contemporary scholastic analyses of Scripture, which sort of broke things down in terms of this is what it means, and we have allegory, and we have mysticism, and we have all these different categories. But for Ibn Ezra and these other figures, it's a lot squishier, is I guess how I would describe it. Some Midrashim are viewed by Ibn Ezra as allegorical. They're teaching a certain ethical message, or they're, sort of a fun story based on grammar twisting or creative rereadings by a certain Hacham. And then other ones, he says, are telling you a much more fundamental sort of deeper meaning to the text, which brings me kind of to the idea of Sod. I think a lot of people, when they hear, Sod, they think of sort of like code words, Kabbalah stuff, letters and amulets and sort of these like random meanings that a master might teach me. But for Ibn Ezra and others, Sod is much more based on the idea of, Yesodei HaTorah, like the foundation behind the text. That if I know the Peshat, I know the core meaning, I know the grammar, and I really try to, analyze what the fundamental, deeper metaphor is trying to teach me about something, that really for him is the Sod. It's a much more sort of foundational principle. And sometimes Midrashim illuminate that, sometimes they're going in other directions. But it all derives from the same core of Peshat. You can't have a Midrash without knowing the grammar and creatively reading the Peshat. You don't know the Sod without knowing what the metaphor is. And to know the metaphor, you have to be able to read the text. And to do any of these things, you have to know grammar and pronunciation and also Torah She'Ba'al Peh. You need to know what the Jewish people traditionally interpret the halachot as in the Pesukim, all of which requires a certain, mesorah and tradition. So I think that's...
So apart from intensive reading skills, by implication, you're also saying that archaeology, science, you have to be able to understand the ancient Israelite context, right? I think that's something where we can really use academia and scholarship. I think that's at the Chabura. We try to, I think Koren does an amazing job at this. They've just produced, I think, like a whole set of Chumash where they're really diving into the history. But really, it's to understand the Peshat, right? That's what I'm understanding from that. Okay, so I think let's move to if you wanted to add anything on the Ibn Ezra. If not, we'll move to the Meiri. This is his Hakdama to Pirkei Avot, and it's very much focusing on the chain of tradition. Rabbi, tell us, first of all, we know that oral law is important, but why is this work and this in particular? I guess it's his understanding of it. Why it's significant, but also how it differs from the more famous Rambam's Hakdama to the Mishneh Torah, where he also tries to trace that link to Sinai. If you could talk about those things.
One thing I want to mention before we talk about that is the very fact that you have an intro is not something to take lightly or for granted. The introductions, at least in Jewish literature, started to be a thing in the Middle Ages, And so you have Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah Torah or to the Mishnah, the Meiri's introduction in this case to Pirkei Avot, but they're often ignored. I notice a lot of times when people are studying whatever they are studying, in their study of Tanakh or Musar or whatever it is, they'll go through whatever it is that they're learning, but the Hakdama gets skipped. And there's a lot of valuable material in almost any Hakdama that you go through. So the Meiri's introduction to Pirkei Avot is a little different compared to what you find in, let's say, for example, Harambam's introduction to the Mishnah, or to his Shemona Perachim, let's say, in the sense that he is a lot more elaborative. He goes into a lot more depth, and he goes into a lot more of the history on the ground, if you will, in each and every generation, sometimes even diverting into different stories from different periods to show you. You can debate why he does this, but if you're asking me, I think it's in order to humanize the experiences of our ancestors in every generation, beginning from Abraham Avinu, really, into his own days, until his own lifetime. And there's one thing that it's the only thing that I'll read inside tonight, don't worry. But I thought that this is really, really important to emphasize, because one of the things that the Meiri actually addresses firsthand is why it is that he even feels that it's important to be writing this commentary on Pirkei Avot. And one of the things he says over here is because Pirkei Avot, which is primarily, morals and ethics, there's close to no, I'm not going to say no halacha, but there's very little emphasis on the observance of the minutiae of law. It's mostly how to conduct yourself as a good human being, as a good Jew, I should say. And so he says, you may treat that lightly. You may say, oh, well, there are no verses in the Torah really that are quoted. It's just some rabbi's opinion, and so you could take it or leave it. And so he says, not so fast. He says, a lot of these things that are mentioned in the Pirkei Avot, they're dvarim lo tavo raya pratif min hamikraot. There's no specific proof that you could bring to support these ideas necessarily. V'lo midarkei hamechkar. You can't prove it using analytical research. V'haikesh ushar hamidot kederech shar hadrachim talmudiim. Like you see in the rest of the Talmud, if you ever study Talmud, there's a lot of analytical reasoning and proof, and there's logic. You can't just dismiss something with a logical fallacy because you'll get called out for it. But here, it's morals, it's ethics. You may not treat it with the same rigor because there's not a lot of room to argue or to prove your position. And so he basically goes on to say that ziruz hamidot, the cautioning and the stress of emphasis of character and morals, is something that is equally as important and equally as valuable and transmitted from one generation to another as a part of our heritage of being a Jewish nation, as part of the heritage that is the Torah. I think in the 16th century, maybe it was the 15th century, Rabbi Obadiah bar Tenura, he was the famous commentator on the Mishnah that just comes a few hundred years after the Meiri. He says, probably not realizing this, he says exactly that Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, the book of ethics of the Jewish people, Pirkei Avot, begins with Moshe received the Torah at Sinai to teach you that the morals and the ethics are just as much a part of the tradition as all 613 commandments are. And so the Meiri begins by saying this to prove to you why it's important to study ethics and morals as a Jew, even if many other cultures and people of the world have it. This is different. This is not like studying Buddha. This is not like studying ethics from some other work. These are profound truths that our Chachamim have transmitted to us one generation from another, and then certain points are emphasized by different Chachamim over the years, perhaps because of their experiences in their lifetime, perhaps because of the situations that generation had to deal with, but all of them are equally as valuable and true. And so that's the basic gist behind why it's so critical to study this introduction, and then in general why it's so important to study Pirkei Avot.
But a lot of the values you find them in Greek literature.
I'm not discounting the fact that you may find a lot of overlap between what you find in Pirkei Avot and in Greek philosophical literature or literature from other parts of the world. You're bound to find overlap in any work of literature between its contents and another group of literature's contents. But there are points that are specific and unique to Pirkei Avot, and that's why we cannot dismiss it as just a work of wisdom.
Ezehu Gibar Hakovesh et Yisrael. That's
right.
Antithetical to the Greek model. The Gibar is the warrior, and here, who is a true warrior? Kovesh et Yisrael.
Right. It's a good example of one difference. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Jackson, tell us a little bit about the Chaim tradition. You also involved in it. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So I think actually there's a big difference between these two works that we're discussing, and I think the big difference really is the idea of Kabbalah, which means authentic transmission of one person to another. So when it comes to the Peshat of the text, so I do need to an extent the Kabbalah of teachers who can teach me how to properly pronounce things and read Ta'amim and the Torah Shebe'al Peh, etc. But at a certain point, it really is about the student of the Mikra reading the text themselves with these tools and interpreting that text in different ways. But when it comes to the Torah Shebe'al Peh, it's a totally different system. So the general view is that Moshe Rabbeinu publishes the written Torah and he gives a scroll to each tribe, meaning to say that it is the constitution of the Jewish nation, and the constitution is in the hands of the entire public. Everyone has some involvement in the Torah Shebichtav. But the Torah Shebe'al Peh says, Harambam in his explanation, he specifically surrenders to Yoshua and his Bet Din. And that's actually how Pirkei Avot begins, by saying that Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, and then he transmits it or surrenders it to Yoshua and his Bet Din. And the word
Yoshua
is the term that is used, Mesirah, refers essentially to, when we say surrendering the text, what it means is essentially Moshe is giving it to the next generation's court and saying, this is now your responsibility. You must keep it, you must guard it actively, you must teach it to the nation, and you may also develop it in the various ways that might happen, right? The Jewish nation needs a court system, it needs legislation to keep the Torah relevant to every generation, that sort of flexibility that I think perhaps some of us have heard before with the Torah Shebe'al Peh. But what that also means is that there's a sort of guardianship that it has compared to the written text, because in this case, the Torah Shebe'al Peh started as a purely oral set of conversations and traditions between various judges and members of the Bet Din. You have the Bet Din Agadol, you had individual smaller Bet Din and throughout the land, and that continues for many, many generations. But as Hama'iri gets into with his Hakdama, at a certain point, the Jewish nation, as we know, began to politically fall apart with the Second Temple era under the Roman rule. The Bet Din Agadol exiles themselves at a certain point from judging capital cases. They simply find that the moral structure of the people is too terrible to even function anymore. And eventually we see that the Bet Din Hagadol itself begins to have temporary points of not functioning and then being reformed in another place and then breaking down again, forming somewhere else. The Hachamim are giving each other semicha, which is a sort of formal court-based authority, but they're doing it in secret, and some of them are being killed over it, and it's a very perilous sort of situation. And so as Hama'iri explains, at a certain point, the Torah Shebe'al Peh was written down as actual texts that we have, the Mishnah and the Talmud, but these texts remain essentially what we would call oral texts, meaning even though I can now open a Talmud and I can read the sugiyot of Talmud and I can see the words, those words were at some point orally spoken. And just as when I speak something to you, there might be ambiguity in what I'm saying and different interpretations, but there's a context to how I say it, my inflections, my emphases, and sort of that specific meaning that I'm giving to you directly. So too, we need that Kabbalah, even reading the Talmud itself as a text. You need a teacher to tell you the meaning of the words and the phrases and the specific ideas behind the statements found in the oral literature, versus a written text like Torah Shebichtav, where I look at the Tanakh itself and there's wiggle room. There's Midrash and there's Sod and there's metaphor, and I can kind of go in different directions. But with the Talmud and with Sugyot, I have a very fixed path of interpretation based on Mesorah and Kabbalah, and there is wiggle room as Hachamim continue to debate, but it's a much different sort of thing. So I think this book really lays out that progression of why the chain is important and why it needs to have continuity even from Bavel, where the Talmud was finished, all the way into Spain and France and all these places. There was a transmission of that teaching and those rabbinics to kind of maintain the continuity. So
I'd like to open it up to questions, but maybe a quick one. If there's one insight or one idea from these works that you think is worth, maybe that's stuck with you, or an idea that people can take with them, what could it be? Think about it. Put you on the spot.
it's a big question.
It's a
Yeah.
big question.
There's something that Harambam writes. If you haven't studied Harambam's letters, they're very, very, very valuable to go through. The Art Scroll is now going through a translation series, actually, of many of Harambam's letters. They're out, I think, with their third volume now, maybe second volume.
I think it's the third.
It's the third
they're
now.
working on, I think.
So if you don't know the Judeo-Arabic or the Hebrew, highly recommend studying, because you get to actually see a lot of the problems that we're discussing now. Maimonides, almost 1,000 years ago, he addressed many of these issues. One of the issues was regarding something that you're seeing resurfacing now a lot on social media. I never thought in my lifetime I'd see this, but you have all these wackos that are Talmudic experts, and they're citing different passages in the Talmud, and all of a sudden the Jews are this, we're that. They're making all sorts of outlandish claims, and they're saying that look at what their rabbis invented. So Harambam dealt with this in a slightly different way, but one of the things that he addresses, and it ties into why Harambam compiled his chain of transmission, is he says, not for you to think that Rabbi so-and-so is the sole reporter of this tradition or of this interpretation, but instead, what we record in his name is that which he is transmitting mipi alafim urvavot. There were tens and thousands of predecessors and vetters of the tradition who stood before Rabbi so-and-so and were able to question and interrogate and refine and debate and so on and so forth, until that became a recorded part of the tradition that made its way into the final text that we have, right? As Jackson said, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and so on and so forth. So when you see statements reflected in our tradition, number one, it's important to remember, and the Meiri makes a point of mentioning this in his introduction as well, that they are not just some rabbi's opinion. They're also not always a matter of tradition that we receive from Moshe Rabbeinu. Sometimes they're, like Maimonides said, they're ideas that were developed and refined, but they were done so mipi alafim uravot, by the general public, tens and thousands of people that were able to examine these points that are recorded. It's a really, really important point when you're coming across something on social media that appears anti-Semitic, that appears outlandish, because 9 times out of 10, I would say maybe even 10 times out of 10, if you're seeing something quoted from a classical Jewish source, I'm not talking about some rabbi on the Upper West Side or from wherever he may be in modern times that's citing his own opinion, but from the real classical sources, if you see something quoted and it sounds ridiculous and outlandish, the odds are it's probably being cited in an outlandish or ridiculous way. But if studied properly, you'll realize that Chachamim are not here to teach things that are absurd, because the Jewish people would have called them out tens of thousands of years ago if that were the case. So that's one of the main points of emphasis that the Meiri makes in his introduction, is that the chain of transmission is important, specifically to realize that these are solid statements with rationale and reasoning and common sense behind them. So, and it applies more so than ever, if you ask me.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that Rosh Hashanah flourished at a time when globally there was flourishing of rational thought, which happened to be with Alexander the Great in the introduction of, again, the Greek rational thought. And it's interesting that Torah Shabbat Peh flourished contemporary to that, and with the prophecies stopping just before.
It's interesting that throughout the period of the Zugot with Alexander the Great, and then moving into, if you want to fast forward, going all the way into the Talmudic period, the Jewish people flourished where there was almost always they flourished where there was freedom of thought.
Yep.
Where, like you correctly said, where we were not persecuted for our beliefs and opinions, and when we were able to engage critically with one another without fear of violence or even verbal abuse, then we flourished. We did very, very well.
They used methods, Greek methods of logic,
Right.
hermeneutics.
Absolutely. And when that ultimately broke down, the Pizur Yater, Maimonides calls it, the great dispersion, occurred specifically when the Jewish people were no longer protected in being able to share their thoughts and to think critically.
Just one plug, by the way, about the Teshuvot.
Mm-hmm.
There's Art Scroll, but we're also just starting a series with Rabbi Dweck right now. I think this Sunday we had a Teshuvah from Rambam on teaching Torah to non-Jews, one so well known. But we have a series, and we've done quite a few in the past. Those are really great. We go kind of through the letter itself, a really great shurim. So strongly recommend. Before we open it up, Jackson, any insight that you think is worth taking?
I just want to actually quickly add to your point, the freedom of thought. It's no coincidence that the Talmud Bavli, which is obviously the major corpus of Torah Shebaal Peh, was formed and primarily created in a very flourishing Jewish community of freedom of thought in the Sasanian Persian area.
Rational thinking.
That's a bit of a debate, I have to say. We can get into the weeds of rhetoric versus logic.
Freedom of thought could be wrong.
But, true. But it's no coincidence that Sharira Gaon and others talk about that when the Talmud really ended was because of extremism taking over the Persian government and really cracking down quite a bit on the Jewish community, and a lot of people left and fled and passed away, and there was bitter conflict. In terms of, I would say, a bigger takeaway for understanding Peshat, I think you were great in terms of the chain of tradition. I think that what I'd like to do also to link it to the Teshuvot, I'm also a big fan of Harambam's letters. I think that if you want to really know the man behind the mask, so to speak, of all of his philosophical writings, you have to read his actual letters, the humanity, the emotion, the personal touch that he really gives to each person that asks him questions. There are some beautiful responses he gives. At one point, very shortly after his publication of Mishneh Torah obviously sent shockwaves throughout the Jewish world. For arguably the first time ever, a Jew who knows nothing but basic rabbinic Hebrew can open up a book and say, these are the halachot that I have to follow. You, Mr. Rabbi, told me it's this, but you're wrong. It says right here that this is what I have to do. And the Jewish world went in an uproar against Harambam. Many communities were writing against him. Certain parts of his books were being banned or burned or worse. And one of his prized students, Rabbi Yosef Ibn Vaknin, who actually is the student he wrote the guide for, got into a lot of very bitter disputes where he lived and got into a lot of arguments with the communal figures about their distaste for Harambam. When Harambam wrote in response to his student, aside from calming him down a little bit and saying, not a big deal that they don't like me, I will forgive them and it won't be a big deal. The bigger thing that he said, I think, which really sticks with me, is he said, Kano kaniti ladonai, is what he says. He quotes the pasuk that Eliyahu Hanavi says when he thinks, I'm the last prophet. All of the other prophets were killed in the north, and I'm the only guy left. I'm the only one who's zealous for God. No one else cares. It's just me. And he goes on his, epic quest of trying to prove that God is the only God to everyone, and obviously all that goes along with that story. But really, Harambam's point is he did everything he did to spread knowledge and Torah in Kelal Yisrael, to really make sure everybody understood as much as possible all of these different things that he felt especially were being lost in the post-expulsion of Al-Andalus. His whole worldview at 15 was collapsed. His homes were gone. He was on the run. His family was fractured. His brother had unfortunately passed away recently during his travels at sea. So Harambam really felt that this was an opportunity to restore what was lost and make sure other Jewish communities did not have this crisis. And by doing so with Mishneh Torah and other things. He said, this is my sole purpose. And I think really that was also Ibn Ezra's point, that when he went to Greater Europe and he saw that the Jews there, they don't know the grammar that we had in the Arabic treatises. They don't have the philosophy we talked about. They don't focus on grammar and Peshat. They study, Rashi and other Midrashim, and they don't really know the difference, and they're kind of blurring things. And Ibn Ezra very easily could have said, I've got my knowledge and I'm good to go from my home, and they're doing their thing. He said, no, I'll sit down, and as you, I think, very nicely put, he was on the run, traveling, business problems, persecution. At one point he was deathly ill in France, and yet he continued to write his Perushim and his other works and his explanations. He was actually the first to write these things from his group in Hebrew and not in Judeo-Arabic, because he said this has to be accessible to every single Jew around me in Europe. That was his main goal. He was also dedicated to democratizing grammar and Peshat and Mikvah to as many people as possible, among many other things. And I think really that is to me, big take home for today. That da'at, knowledge, is not something which you keep within you or that you steal away, or you say, I'm a big person and I know all these things and I'm going to tell you what to do and go and do what I say. No. Da'at means I take it, I internalize it, and I place it back out for others, and I infuse it with them, and I help guide them, and then they begin to develop their own ideas. And then they end up going to other people, and then they start talking about it, and then they spread it more, and it continues to expand, and soon everyone knows how to learn Mikvah, everyone knows how to learn Halakha, everyone is able to participate in the covenant as equal Jews who are able to think and reason through things. And I think that really is the push that not just Ibn Ezra, but many of the Hachamim we've spoken about tonight have tried to, imbue us with, and that really would be my take-home message: is to continue on your own to study what's important to you, and to not just keep it within you once you've studied it. To try and find other people that are interested, whatever they have questions, and to talk to them about it. Open dialogues, because you never know if that person has never heard of something, and you also don't know if they know something you've never heard of. Now you have an exchange of ideas, and wonderful things can emerge. So.
Great advert for Dart Press.
Yes.
I'm sure Sinner, he'll clip this and make a great video, but beautiful. So any questions about Peshat, the tradition, anything that's been said? I'll just say one thing that I don't think we've mentioned about the Meiri. When there was the debates about sort of the philosophy of Harambam, and there was a movement to try ban the study of the Moreh Nevuchim at least, and maybe parts of Sefer Madar, Mishneh Torah. Maybe was actually really someone who felt that it had gone too far and came to the defense of those who were studying it, and at a time when it was probably unpopular. And as we know, when there's a movement, a momentum to try ban and to sort of chase someone out of town, it's not easy to kind of stand up to that. And the Meiri, and you said he wasn't someone who had, he wasn't the chief rabbi of Perpignan. He was obviously a Talmid Chacham, and people knew that, but he decided that he would step up. So there's also something interesting about that worth saying. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. Speaking of stepping up, the Rav mentioned as an example, and I believe the Ibn Ezra actually wrote a whole essay defending the honor of Friday night. Friday night is Shabbat, which really makes it interesting that later figures, probably Ashkenazim, that's why was it elsewhere in the world, where they accused Ibn Ezra of heresy or something else. And he was the one who, he wrote it's interesting. He and Rashbam lived in the same town, the same small town. I forget the name now. A friend of mine gave a talk about it for a while. So they must have known each other
for some period.
For some period, yeah. I believe at the same time.
They sent poetry to one another, to my knowledge.
Yeah. So now, in classical, the Rav mentioned Mikra'ot Gedolot. In classical Mikra'ot Gedolot, Rashbam is not printed. Pirush Rashbam is not printed on the first three parshiot. You will find it only beginning in Vayera. in Hamaor,
It's reprint.
it's right. But the traditional ones, why? Because there was some misunderstanding, because now we have the Kitav Yad, and it's not so. But again, as we know, Rashbam often, he translated verses, and Chachamenu say something else in Halacha. He himself was about Tosfot. Halacha, but it's Pirush could contradict the Gemara. He wasn't, and they said that the Rashbam wrote B'Yevmei Boker the way he understood it, the way they thought he's saying it, the way they thought he's explaining it. Friday night is not Shabbat.
So I'll say like this: I cannot speculate as to why.
So what the printer did is left him, instead of censoring him the way it's done today, unfortunately, the printer just left out the whole first three parashiyot.
Yeah, I think. By the way, I think Professor Mark Shapiro in his work,
Yes.
he mentions this as one of the forms of rabbinic censorship in modern times. But one of the things that I'll add, and I'm not a mind reader. I don't know why there's a certain reservation about mentioning or quoting Ibn Ezra in more right-wing, quote-unquote, black hat Haredis, or however you want to label it. But if you really want to play that game, I tell these people, then your own rabbis are heretics. Because you take a look at like Rashbam, for example, the grandson of Rashi, and he has this buzzword that we use in his commentary from time to time. He says, such and such, lefi omek pshuto shel mikra, he says, according to the absolute deepest literal sense of what this means. I'll give you two examples. One of them is he interprets that the Torah, when it says, and there was day and there was night, day one, right? Vahi erev, vahi boker, yom echad. That was true because nothing else preceded existence. So there was evening, then there was day, and now from now on, moving forward, you can begin counting from the day. Sunrise is the start of the day, and the next day doesn't begin until the sun rises again. That, he says, is the fi omek peshuto shel mikra. Another example he gives by you mentioned tefillin, right. Yeah. By tefillin, he says, according to the absolute truest depth of the literal meaning, when we say in the Shema, that's it's a metaphor, and he quotes from Mishlei in I think you're right. No, I think you're right, actually. From Shir HaShirim. Simeni kachotam al libecha. Place me on your, like a seal upon your heart, right. Like Shlomo HaMelech says. It's allegorical. It doesn't mean that Shlomo HaMelech was buying seals and putting them on his heart. It's a metaphor.
Which is ironic because Chazal on that Shir HaShirim actually interpreted as dafka, physical seal. So,
it is kind of ironic. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. You're right. But it could be read both ways. Right. So unfortunately, I think the reason why Ibn Ezra is criticized is not because of his focus on deviating in Peshat, like Rashbam does sometimes, and he gives original interpretations that deviate from the norm. I think it was because, unlike Rashbam, Ibn Ezra, and this is one thing I didn't address earlier, he was also one of the first to introduce sarcasm. He was very, very sarcastic in his commentary. I'll give you one example of this. He also quotes sources that are unorthodox. Rashbam doesn't do that. So, for example, we read last week, right? God should be, that's the debate. How do you translate that word, yaft? So, for now, we'll say, God should be gracious to Yefet, and he should dwell in the tents of Shem. Okay? So, Ibn Ezra says, Yefet Amar, not Yefet Noachsan, but Yefet Ibn Ali, the Karaite commentator, whose works, by the way, are also being published now for the first time from Arabic by Bar Ilan Press, by a few other presses. Very
accidentally cited by Art Scroll a few times.
Is that so? Yeah. It's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Okay, so he says, Yefet says God should be gracious. He should make Yefet beautiful and gracious, right? Velo Yafet Piresh, and it's a pun, right? Yefet says that God should be beautiful and gracious to Yefet, but he's not saying Yafet, right? It's like an old school diss, It's so people got upset at that. That's one example. It's a very, very benign example, by the way. But he was very, very critical, with respect, of some of his peers, and people didn't like that. he quotes Karaites, he quotes astronomers, he quotes different sources from his days that you typically would not find the French rabbis quoting. I think that's why he gets criticism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The Bet Midrash, the start of business is sunrise. The business day of
That's for different
That's
reasons.
bothering me.
That's for totally different reasons. I'm not going to get to that right now.
Question in the corner. Yolo?
Yeah, I'm still thinking it through how to word it, but so I guess the question would be if Peshat is the sensus communis, it sounds very subjective in some sense. Over time it could change depending on the community. What's the limit of that change? And what's to say, for example, nowadays you might hear in certain circles, they can say it, we cannot, because they would say the majority has decided otherwise. That kind of sounds like the sensus communis has changed according to that approach.
Right.
What's the limit of that change?
That is a good question. I'll start by just noting that anytime, at least in my experience, I hear they said it but we cannot, I think it's code for, I really think that this is somewhat heretical, but because they're a gadol in my eyes, I really can't criticize it. When I would perhaps say that it is either problematic or whatever, you didn't understand it. In terms of the limits, I think that, and I addressed this in my introduction, that the biggest limit is Torah Sheba'al Peh, for the reasons I think we spoke a little bit about, that also I go into it. Understanding Peshat, Mayiri goes into it, that the Hachamim have the legal authority to both transmit and legislate the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So, if I read the Totafot Pesukim, I have to say that is the Peshat, is those, Torah Sheba'al Peh commandments. That is essentially a static thing, which if you're in the, we'll call it the rabbinic Kabbalah of Judaism, that's the way that works. And then, of course, I think that the grammar and the contextual understandings of the verses also need to be critically examined properly, and you can't just, kind of reject those. That, the written words and the written letters themselves do provide a certain fixed frame that you can't necessarily break away from. But I think, for example, a good example is, in terms of science, Ibn Ezra and others interpret a lot of, passages scientifically based on Aristotle, medieval scientific views of the elements and different spherical models of the earth and the sun and the moon and all of these things, which I don't necessarily know if the ancient Israelites, thought that way all the time, or if they had the same scientific system. I would assume it, continued to progress, even just as now, us reading in the science of our times are going to look at it very differently. And I think really that's where you get into the idea that the sensus communis can change. And it's about kind of, delving more into the understanding. So, for example, when Ibn Ezra talks about Gan Eden, does it really matter if I have to believe that a serpent really can have legs and, talk to a human or not? Maybe at a certain point, there were ancient Israelites who would have understood that as a literal change in nature. And maybe my own scientific mind today would say, I don't think that that's how that worked. But at the end of the day, if the sensus communis is still, asking the question of what is the point of this whole thing and why do I even, care about this narrative at all? What is it teaching me? Then that's really, I think, the value that, Ibn Ezra and others, I think, really continue to go into. He points out that, there's different meanings to different things. There's a Hazal that, the Torah, it's like shards. You hammer it, it breaks into all these different shards. And, we say that the joke is always there's 70 faces, not 71 to Torah. There are limits, but there are quite a few different directions that Hachamim in the past, and I think today's thinkers, can traverse, if you will. So.
So yeah, you mentioned sort of the idea of like going to ancient Near Eastern sources, grammar, and so maybe like now in our days we can study archaeology and different texts from different cultures, Babylon, things. So I'm just curious, in the event of like a contradiction between like an ancient Near Eastern source and like the Peshat of Ibn Ezra, for example, like the boiling kids spilled milk, like what if that turns to be like this ancient Canaanite ritual? So like what do you do in that case?
So I have a beautiful solution for you, and it's called Study the Moreh Nebuchim, assuming you're able to. The third Helek, Harambam, directly talks about many of the Hukim especially as being related to ancient Near Eastern pagan rituals that they used to do, and that the Torah is directly responding essentially to the milieu that the ancient Israelites lived in, that you're surrounded by idolatry and all of these random superstitious practices, and the point of the Torah is to say, I'm taking these things and I'm presenting them to you in a different sort of framework. So I think that the study of comparative religion is, I guess, a technical, like, academic term, can definitely be valuable, as Harambam and others, I think, examined it. Another, I think, beautiful example of that is a Hacham Eliyahu ben Amozeg from the 1800s. He was very in love with comparing ancient Assyrian languages and all these different cultures. And when it comes to contradicting Ibn Ezra, I think Ibn Ezra himself would have said, my word is not gospel. I'm not the guy. I'm doing what I can with what I have. And if you provide a more convincing, so for example, this past week, with Noah, so it's the Tower of Bavel. And Ibn Ezra examines that Bavel is related to Bilbul and confusion, and he analyzes the Pesukim and talks about how the root is, it's weird. There's 2 bets and a lamed, not a bet and 2 lameds. So how do you match up the shoresh? And he tries to examine it, and he comes to the conclusion that it is the same thing. Well, in the 1800s, Rav Ben Amozeg points out that doesn't really make any sense. And he then notes that in ancient literature of the, other languages that he had access to, he found that it actually is a composite of 2 different words, beginning with the word Bav, which means like a gate. And in the modern research we have, Bavel turns out to be a totally different meaning than Bibul. It means gate of the gods. It's this like massive power structure sort of name. But once you realize that, and you see that the Torah is essentially making a pun by twisting the shoresh on purpose, to make something that's, a powerful gate of the gods, and to, God metaphorically looks down at it like, this is nothing to me, and I'm going to scatter you, and it's Bilbul, and your guys are, little kids like playing around in adult clothes right now. But it really enhances to me the understanding of what we're dealing with. And I do believe to an extent that, the ancient Israelites who studied the Tower of Babel story would have likely recognized the linguistic pun that was going on, and taken that fundamental message of, dictators and God and how all of these things work that, hopefully we can discover more of as we continue our research. So,
Rabbi, I have a question for you, sort of what you were talking about earlier. So, if people who want to look at the Chumash specifically in a more logical way and, translate that into Judaism and doing things more for rational purposes, and how would you suggest that people should engage with, let's say, if you want to call it the mainstream, or certainly in the educational sector, the people who are more mainstream in the educational sector who, everything that Rashi says, even if it doesn't make so much sense, or everything Midrash says, just for example, if you look at today in Israel, you have a pasuk, and people look at the Rashi, obviously, and say it's, they ignore what the actual Peshat of the Torah says, and obviously that in Israel is one thing, but in America, I'm sure, plays out in many ways. So how would you suggest we engage with people who only want to look at the Torah in a certain more, how you call it, mystical way?
So that verse specifically, where Yaakov Avinu says that he took this portion of the land of Israel with his sword and with his bow and arrow, that's actually much, 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 much later, I think, in Parashat Vayechi. So we're not going to get to that till quite some time from now. But your question is a really good question, because we encounter many different styles of interpretation nowadays. Some rabbis, like you said, have more of a mystical bend when they teach the Torah. Some, particularly in Jewish day schools, are very focused on Rashi. What we need to do, and by we I mean those who want to carry on in the tradition of our ancestors, in the tradition of Chachmei Sefarad, by sticking to these fundamentals and basics, is to show how it is not divorced from the Torah's intent in our tradition, which is ultimately to build 2 things: Yirat Shamayim and observance of the mitzvot. Those are the 2 basic fundamentals that you cannot lose sight of, no matter what book of the Torah you're studying, no matter what book of the Navi you're studying, no matter what portion of the Ketuvim you're studying. The entire Hebrew Bible rests on these 2 fundamentals, if you ask me. And so this was one of the criticisms that Meiri and Chachmei Provence, the rabbis of Provence, deal during the Maimonidean controversy was actually regarding this point. They accused the Maimonideans of having no Yirat Shamayim. They're not meticulous in their observance of the mitzvot. There's a very, it's difficult to find, but there's a very, very beautiful letter, difficult to read, very polemical letter, an exchange between the Av HaParshanim, one of the greatest biblical commentators, David Kimchi, or Kamchi, some say, I say Kimchi, and between Rabbi Yehuda al-Faqar, who was the president of the community of Toledo in the 13th century, and they go back and forth on this issue. You rationalists, it's ironic because they kind of grew up within the same milieu. They were both Sephardic by descent, if you will, but this was one of the claims that was brought against them. You're studying, Torah in light of the basics, in light of science, in light of reason, and look what it's created. It's created a bunch of heretics out of your students. And he says, what are you talking about? What are you, crazy? Our students are the ones who are mashkimim, the batei knesiot, batei midrashot. We are the ones that rise up early to go to the synagogues, to go to the study halls. We don't abolish the institutions that our ancestors have preserved, such as reading the Targum in the synagogue, like I mentioned earlier. It's your students who have abolished that. And ultimately, that's the tradition that ended up prevailing because people got lazy. They didn't know Aramaic. They didn't know what the Targum was saying. And so they said, you know what? Study the Rashi. It's just as good. You can't just reinvent the wheel like that. That's called reform, right? We have a word for that. So Radak in his letters, very respectfully, by the way, he treats Rabbi Yehuda al-Faqar, who's probably in his 40s or 50s at the time. He was an 80-year-old man. He was well into his 80s. And yet, look at the way he deals with him. He deals with him with kavod, with derech eretz. He treats him as a superior, even though he was his inferior. And in doing so, he built rapport, I think, depends who you ask. But he built a sense of rapport with him. He stood firm in his tradition. He stood proud of his tradition. And demonstrating, not that he's right. This is not a question of who is right or wrong. It's a matter of, is my path in studying Torah, building Yirat Shamayim, and observance of the mitzvot? Everything else is really secondary. Somebody mentioned earlier, I think you had mentioned, how do you know whether or not the sensus communis morphs or changes? There's a very insightful, brief but insightful comment that Rabbi, another so-called controversial commentator, but he says it is Perush to Devarim, chapter 17 of Devarim, in Parashat Shofetim. He says, he gives you a rule of thumb. If I could leave you with anything, it's this lesson. He says, when it comes to studying the Torah, use grammar, reason, the basic tools that guide us in studying any text. But where it contradicts Jewish law, when it contradicts the halacha as our chachamim have transmitted, we always give deference to them. Always. Anything else is free reign. It's an open marketplace of ideas as long as your thoughts have been examined, they're well established, and you can prove your point. And if you're wrong and somebody calls you out for it, don't go defending nonsense.
Last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
So in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, Rambam says that the first thing is to know God. Whereas the positive hand is to know God. Why do you say the first thing is fear the heavens?
It's a. Let me revise what I said. When I say Yirat Shamayim, I don't mean fear in the sense that we use that word in English. Yirat Shamayim, more accurately translated, really means reverence of God. Showing how do you show reverence to someone? Like when you, I don't know if you've ever been to court, but if you, okay, all right. So if you, listen, as a pretty mindless 16-year-old, I just got in my license, and I was driving back one Saturday night to pick up a pizza. And this police officer pulls me over, and he gives me a ticket. He thinks I'm a pizza delivery boy who's speeding. I don't know why he thought that, but I insist I don't work for the pizza shop. But, sure enough, I had to go to court. I had to go to court to deal with this ticket. And that was the first time in my life I really understood the word reverence. I really understood that word because I didn't know who the judge was, but I knew what he's capable of. Right? I knew he's capable of issuing me this great fine. I knew he's capable of revoking my license. I knew that I have no idea how to even address him. Do I say Your Honor? Do I say Sir? These are things that, on a very, very small scale, gives you a sense of what reverence is. Kol sheken ben beno shel kal vachomer, all the more so when you're talking about the King of Kings, the Judge of all judges. To know him, to study the world around him, to study the blueprints that he left behind for us in this universe is the ultimate way, at least according to Harambam, that a person can develop this sense of yira, of not fear, but of reverence towards God. The more you come to be aware of someone's presence, the more you're able to respect, revere, admire, and love. Right? It's not just reverence. It's a mix of emotions that a person has to develop. So.
On that beautiful note, I really want to thank our panelists. Rabbi Zarnighian came all the way from Philadelphia and has to go back. So we really thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Jackson has to go to the Bronx. So. I just want to say, you mentioned really briefly Mark Shapiro. Our next event, please God, put it in your calendars, Sunday, November the 9th. We're going to have Mark Shapiro on his book on new book on Rav Kook and his unique vision. That's going to be in Midtown. We already have a venue and very excited for that. In conversation with Dr. Ronnie Perelis of Yeshiva University. So please do make an effort on a Sunday. And then thank you all. Pardon?
That's in the evening?
It's Sunday evening around 6 or 7 o'clock. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. There's Dark Press. There's a QR code that you can get these books, and there's many others. Great website. Please feel free to take that with you or scan it at least. Thank you, everyone. Let's talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. It was amazing when you speak. It's like I mean it. I was not.
Oh, you were really.